Hello, Michael Elligate here. I'm going to do a bit of a presentation on a booklet that we got published in the last few weeks that led into Lent. And this is part of the Garratt projects, whereby for quite some years now, we've had a series of very helpful guides to prayer, scripture, just different formats that happen during the Sundays of Lent. And the idea was that individuals may use a booklet themselves, or a group may gather, or a number of groups in a parish may gather to be renewed in a helpful sort of way that's in the mind and heart of the church during the days and nights of Lent. And also for those who wish to discuss and hopefully expand their faith life. So just to say a few things about the context of the booklet that we've produced. I've just retired from appointment in parishes for 48 years and have obviously preached regularly, and you start to get a feel for what the congregation can be helped by or bored by. So I've given a fair bit of thought to not only looking at the Sundays of Lent for 2022, but I've tried to think through something of the atmosphere, the context in which we are gathering this year, if we gather or quietly sit somewhere at home or in the garden or whatever, and think about these matters. They're in a context because we see that each of the Gospels is quite different, presents a very different aspect of Jesus because they're written for contexts. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say a little bit about Scripture, because one of the most constant observations made by people that share the Eucharist with us is that preaching is often not engaging, it's not enlightening, and it doesn't lead to some sort of refreshment in the life of the Spirit. Far too many preachers speak of Scripture as if it's a diary. The Gospels are diaries of what Jesus did each day, and they're far from diaries. They're highly stylized accounts of moments in the life of Jesus, and they're told in a certain sort of way to meet a need of the time. And once you get onto that, Scripture starts to come alive rather than a boring text written like an old diary and shoved in the corner. We bring them out and they take on a dynamic feel for life. So, first of all, the context, because I feel that often publications we put out for Lent or Advent are very much rosy and very Pollyanna, because we start from now, we're Jesus' disciples and we're part of this dynamic, wonderful church. And we're all very happy, and off we go on a little picnic, a little journey. Well, it's not like that. I think that one thing that's really guided me in terms of the context of the moment is to do what those we call the evangelists, or those that led the writing of Scripture, what led them above all was having to face reality, the moment. So, welcome to our church that's not in good shape. We've just finished those series of lockdowns, and a lot of people are saying, I don't think I'll bother going back, or we'll go sometimes. And that's the morale drops out of the bottom of church life in local scenes very often. There's a disillusionment as the pews or seats don't fill up. And so we really are into a situation that is perfectly met in Mark's Gospel. The show was going down. The boat was sinking. The waves were crashing in. And so Mark writes this brilliant piece of work. It's short, sharp, succinct, that said, yes, there will be failure, but out of our failure and pain will come hope and vitality. So if that is the way Mark writes a gospel for the current needs of the time, we're perfectly blessed in using the same insight as a starting point. When we look at the other Gospels, why were they written? We take, say, Matthew's Gospel, possibly written because there was not enough bridging between the great ancient tradition of Judaism and the way of Jesus, the community of the Nazarene following Jesus as broken, crucified, yet risen. And so the one we call Matthew writes a gospel in that context. Don't panic because you're leaving the synagogue or the temple and coming over to the house where the breaking of bread happens, and the stories, his words, his attitudes, his presence is proclaimed. And so if you read Matthew's Gospel, it's saturated with Jewish names, Jewish symbols, Jewish faith. We've got the Psalms, the prophets, and enormous reference to the faith tradition that Jesus was raised in. But then we find there's a restlessness that another one who we call Luke says, but we've got to do something for those who weren't Jewish. Paul has started to write for the Gentiles, and Luke has seen the need to produce a gospel that tells this set of people who are not Jewish and have now come over to the way of Jesus, the ones who are the Gentile. So Luke writes a gospel where the outsider, the fringe dweller, the alienated one finds a place, because that's the gnawing problem for the Gentile communities that have come over to the way of Jesus. Incidentally, it is that fact, the Gentile mission, that's dependent very much on the fantastic missionary spirit and energy and insight of Paul, together with, to my mind, the most beautiful of the Gospels, with healing and hope in them, that Luke is responsible for. That means that the Gentile mission really takes off. And one of the beautiful features in Luke, and thankfully this year we're reading Luke's Gospel on Sundays, there's in Luke's Gospel, it's like a spine running through a book that holds it together. This spine has within it a whole series of precious meals at which the stranger is welcomed, affirmed, understood, forgiven, blessed, and goes away with a new hope, a new fulfillment. Right through Luke's Gospel, this series of wonderful meals. And we'll come back to that again. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke produce a text that is aware of the moment, the context, what's with this, what's with us as we dare to pause and to reflect. And then, of course, some of the most remarkable scholarship has happened with the fourth gospel, John's very, very different sort of gospel, written later than the others, and it produces the grandiose view of Jesus as the Son of God, as the glorified one, the eternal Word. And John's Gospel is poetic and musical and artistic and has its own feel in its glory day stuff, even though the tragedy of the cross and the outpouring of the Lord's own body and blood are clear. It's a gospel of immense hope that has a different celebratory feel to it than you would get, say, in, say, Mark's gospel, where in fact the emphasis on the broken one who brings us to the empty tomb and the mystery of, oh my God, how do we handle this? Present in Mark, explained very differently in John. So what I've done in the first part of the booklet for Lent for this year is to just give a broad background to the Gospels. And I think there's a desperate need. As soon as a preacher opens their mouth, you know whether they're going to take us down a pious track that's pretty dry, or they invite us to go with them down a dynamic track that leads us to a path with the Lord. And the Gospels leap to life in a way that is remarkable. So context this year, we will be aware of it's a time after the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse in Religious Institutions. The conscience of the church has been pushed about. We haven't had a good record for the way that we've handled these horrible moments in the lives of Christians and Christian communities. The leadership of the church would readily say, we got it wrong, we were silent while pain was perpetrated. So we then have the post-jab sort of COVID time, lockdown time, when we weren't able to go to Mass, when doors were closed, and all that can lead and prompt a greater absence from our communities for Sunday worship and for being part of the praying Eucharistic community. So after an outline of each of the Gospels and the context. And that'll be very helpful, not just for what we're doing this year, but we'll often invite people into a fresh look at purpose and aim of a gospel. We then go into the particular Sundays, the Sundays of Lent. And we leave an option that you may wish to use the psalm of the Sunday that would be, in church would be read prior to the gospel. And they have different insights for different Sundays. What I've tried to do is look through the best of scholarship in terms not only of appraisal of a text, but the merit of how a gospel becomes pastorally not only functional, but highly contagious in what it wants to get to, in the story of Jesus fasting in the wilderness, for example, or the puzzling sort of story of the Transfiguration. We can go right through each of the Gospels. And what I've tried to do in the notes that come with the Gospel for each of the Sundays, take what I find sometimes unusual, sometimes a fairly familiar insight, but they enable us to read and listen to the gospel, particularly Luke's gospel this year, in a context that's our time. And so the notes you will find on one part of the page after the text of the gospel is there, and before you go to a number of discussion points, just read, perhaps, hopefully, before the gospel discussion and sharing those points, because often they take you in a new direction. For example, that scene of Jesus being in the desert and being tempted. I read fairly recently of a new research study that looked at that as a post-Freudian, interesting, post-Freudian approach. It's a dreamlike sequence in which Jesus is confronted. And in many ways, it makes sense that dreams can often be a highly reliable indicator of where our inner and outer self is present at the moment. So just have a look at the notes, the scriptural notes that go with each of the texts, and then you enter into the sharing of, well, not just sort of answering questions, but the questions are there to lift you to a moment of saying, well, what else would be involved in this gospel story? That will give you a helpful format to be maybe educated a little bit more in terms of what scripture scholars of the moment are thinking and are researching and bringing to us. It will give us some ways of perceiving a gospel text that will take a deeper and more diverse track into our own lives, because we start to see the broader application of a gospel in our lives. And then finally, there's a little bit toward the end on approaching Holy Week and in the sacramental tradition, the 3 great days of the Triduum, from Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then Easter. A little bit there that maybe sums up something of where have we come from and what do we do now. So I hope you find the booklet helpful. I feel that it's really been, for me anyway, it's certainly been a helpful exercise to understate what I intended to do. But I have discussed the presentation with people who no longer go to church, people who somehow hang in there and don't know why, and others that have found a quality of faith and ministry in the life of their local churches that makes them say, I must go back. So from whatever point we journey in this Lent, I hope that the text will be helpful for you. So happy Lent, and may your Easter be special this year.